Reading the room during a presentation. So reading the room is what you call it when you walk into a space and you recognize the atmosphere in the room. And then you watch what people are doing to make sure you know what they're feeling. Are they following what you're saying? You've all, I'm sure, met people who do not know how to read a room, who make a joke that really falls flat because it's just not a group of people that would find that joke funny or things like that. But as instructors, it's really important to think about reading the room. How do we make sure we have a sense of what space the students are in right now, and how do we make sure we're able to see it if they're not understanding what we're saying, if they're not following what we need them to be understanding during our presentation. It's about mindfulness. So the idea of mindfulness is that you're really in the moment, that you don't just come in as a teacher and say, this is the content I have to get through in the next 50 minutes, but I really need to present this in a way that the students are engaged and understanding it to the best of my ability. And so we really want to make sure we are thinking about where are the students right now? How can I meet them where they are right now? Some of it is about making sure you're giving them a good, calm, supportive learning environment no matter what. Do they feel like they can ask questions without being ridiculed? Do they feel like I'm really there to help them learn it? Like I have time and interest in them as individuals learning it. And that is evidenced to them by looking them in the eye and by how you present yourself physically. You're not off checking your phone or something like that. So there are pieces of it that are about how we present ourselves to them and pieces of it that are about how we assess what they're presenting back to us. When you are truly there to engage with the students, it also means you have to give up your plans a little bit. So sometimes you have come in with a very clear idea that, man, I got to get through the ovary today because we're talking about the uterus starting on Thursday or whatever. In my world, it's important, the ovaries in the uterus. But for us to be thinking about always, what if they're really lost? What if I thought they had a lot of background knowledge about the ovaries and instead I find out, nope, they assumed they were going to get that in my class. That means sometimes you have to set your plans aside and say, okay, you guys look really confused about this anatomy, so let's review that for a minute. What's different about a horse ovary that's different from a cow ovary that's different from a dog ovary, and just take the time to back up a little bit before they can go ahead. It's better for you to lose that time and make sure they're keeping up with you than to just forge ahead if they're lost. So one thing to think about first is the atmosphere. What is it like when you walk into that room? And again, this is not necessarily about sort of that consistent, psychologically safe environment that we want to create for learning. Those things that we do to let students know you are there to help them learn. That's sort of a separate piece. Dr. Vesna Hampel-Kozar gave a nice presentation about that in a teaching tip last year. That's available at this link. If you go to the hard copies of the slides, you can click on that name and it will take you to that link. And that is actually a great presentation about how we consistently provide that for them. But I'm talking more about when you walk into the room, what are the students like? Or if you're on Zoom, what are they like? Are they paying attention? Are they calm? Are they quiet? Are they very agitated? So thinking about what you hope to see and what you do see. Ideally, there's a little bit of talking. It's not really agitated. They've got their computers up if they're supposed to. They're in their seats. They're ready to roll. That would be the ideal atmosphere, but that isn't always what we get as a teacher. So what if they're really quiet and the atmosphere is really somber, like they're just not talking? So sometimes you'll see this if they just got out of a really hard exam or if something bad is happening. So if there's something happening in the community that's hard, or if they just found out something about their class that's hard for them, sometimes the students will be very quiet and very low energy when you come into the room. So recognize that lower energy. So maybe recognize they're probably going to have shorter attention span. And so just take more breaks. Present something, stop and ask if they have any questions. Maybe talk about a case that you saw with that problem. Ask some questions. Ask them to talk to their peers. Think of ways to sort of gently boost their energy back up. And then when you're coming up with those active content pieces, don't make them ridiculous. You don't make them stand up and dance. Don't do anything like that. It's more like, let's take this material, let's use it, let's just generate your interest without really requiring them to try to put on a brand new level of energy. Use the energy that you have and build on it a little bit, and just recognize they're just going to be quieter that day. What if they're super revved up? Sometimes you come in and they are hyped. Something great just happened to their class. They all just found out what their rotations are. So, it's sometimes it's just a day that you come in and you're just like, wow, they are so jazzed right now. I just don't know if they're going to listen to anything I have to tell them. So this time they got a super high energy level. And so this time, again, they've got the shorter attention spans. You're going to want to maybe give them things in smaller bites and make sure they're keeping up with you and not heading off again in other directions. And as they calm down, then they'll have gradually longer attention spans. And so you have to sort of vary it over the time. And again, sometimes you're going to want to intersperse it with active things. But this time, let's work off some energy. This is the time to say, okay, so here are the 3 options for what we could do with this case. Everybody who thinks we should go to surgery, get up and move over to the left. Everybody who thinks we should do it medically, move to the back of the room. Something where you make them get up and move and work off some of that energy and excitement, and they could talk to each other, and you just sort of give them a couple of minutes to work some of that out of their system. Sometimes they're just super tired. It's like they would like to be engaged, but they just don't have it in them. Maybe it's the end of the semester. Maybe they just got out of live animal surgery labs. That's always a rough time in 3rd year, that if they have those live animal surgery labs, they're anxious. And so that worries them beforehand. And then afterwards, it's like they're just tired because it's just been such a big mountain for them to climb. And so what if they just seem really tired and like it's really difficult for them to be engaged? And again, we got lower energy going. And so sometimes here, it's really getting them back interested. It's helping them build back in so they can find ways to make themselves more interested. So use good examples. Use a lot of case examples. They like case examples. Let them see how they're going to use this information in their next coursework, things like that. And this would be a good place to put in humor. I like to use humor in my teaching. Other people don't. I think it depends on how natural it is for you, but this might be a place to do it, even if you're not terribly comfortable with humor, because the students will recognize that you're trying to help them kind of come up in their energy level a little bit. And so usually they're a little more forgiving, if you will, at this point, even if you're not really comfortable with that sort of thing. Just that idea of doing things to kind of regain their interest. What about understanding? How do you tell if the members of your audience are confused? So first of all, there are some very good nonverbal cues. Usually if they're confused, they frown at you, they squint at you, they lean back in their chairs. Like, if I get away from this person, I will see the bigger picture and I will understand it. They talk to their neighbors, they look at their notes, they're doing things that show you that they are not necessarily grasping what you're talking about. If they're understanding, they nod at you, they smile at you, they lean towards you when they're understanding. And you'll find that in a given class, there are some students who really use those nonverbals a lot, and they're good students to watch because they'll be a good barometer for you. One for me always is if there's a lot of chatter in the class all of a sudden. If the class either gets extremely silent or extremely chattery, and then especially if they go to look at their notes, then I know either I've just said something strange or I've said something that they learned differently someplace else. And then it's really good to just stop and say, it seems like a lot of you are talking about something. Did I say something unusual, or what's the problem here? And then usually there will be a student or two who will say, well, we learned in pathology that it's blah, blah, blah. And that gives you that opportunity to clarify for them. Sometimes if you are going to say, hey, it seems to me like everybody's confused right now. Let's take a 2-minute break. Talk to your buddy, and then everybody write down on a slip of paper what you're confused about, and then just drop those on the table, and then I'm going to take a quick look, and then we'll talk about what's confusing. That helps those students who are less willing to raise their hand and say, I didn't learn it this way, still have a chance to process it and to participate in the class. Anytime anybody looks confused, you should stop. And even if it's only a couple of people, just stop for that moment and say, I'm feeling like some of you aren't understanding what's going on. I just want to make sure that we're all really clear on this. And do not stop it and say, so what I'm seeing some confusion, but we all know that this and this happens to the ovary, right? Because if you say that, they're never going to raise their hand and say, I don't remember that about the ovary. You don't want to imply that they should understand it. You want to make sure that you're being very clear. I feel like I have confused you, and I would like to know how I can help you understand it. And so make sure your language doesn't unintentionally push them away from being willing to share that with you. And when you try to readdress it, really try to look at it a different way. That we all have sort of a way that we explain things, a way that you've said it a million times. Really try to be conscious of thinking about, how could I describe this differently? What's a different analogy that I could use? Could I describe this as a case presentation? What is happening that is keeping these students from understanding it the way I have always routinely described it? How do you tell if your audience is really unengaged? They're just unengaged or really bored in your class. It can actually be really hard to tell for sure, because students can just be sitting back in their chair and looking at their computer and watching exactly what you're talking about. They're on your notes or they're following your PowerPoint, and they're just a quiet person and they're following along just fine. Other students have that computer open and they are shopping for shoes, and it can be very hard to tell if you are not where you can see their computer. Nobody can really multitask. I mean, if they're shopping for shoes, they're probably not really following what you're talking about in lecture. And so in a way, that is disrespectful to you, but you have to think hard about how much you try to work around that. Is it really your job to keep them engaged? If you're giving a good presentation and they're choosing to shop for shoes, they're making a choice. And at some level, it's not your problem as long as they're not bothering the people around them. Some people will ask students to close their computers, and the students generally will not all do it. Some of them actually physically feel like they cannot close that computer, and the same thing will happen if you will ask students to put away their phones. They might turn them upside down. That's about as far as they're going to go. They are not going to put them away. And so you have to decide, how hard are you going to fight that battle? And consider why you're uncomfortable, because as I said, if it's that they're distracting somebody else, then I'm going to address it. If it's that they're just choosing to ignore me, I'm going to let it go, because they're the ones paying the money to listen to me, and I know I'm giving them good stuff. And if they chose to ignore that, they choose to ignore that. So at some point, you really have to think about, why am I uncomfortable? Is it just that they're making me uncomfortable by ignoring me? Well, that's my thing, and I can learn to get past that. As opposed to, no, they're distracting everybody around them. That's not fair to their fellow students. Those are the sorts of things to be thinking about as you think about how you're going to address it with the students. Some people will come to class and do things to keep themselves engaged. They'll knit, they'll crochet, they'll doodle, whatever. And there's a lot of evidence that for some people that absolutely is what keeps them engaged in the class, even though it looks like they're distracted by what they're doing. And so it's, for some people, that fidgety thing really does help them stay focused in the class. And again, if it's not bothering the people around them, I tend not to let it bother me. The last thing to think about is, no matter how engaging you are, no matter how magnificent your presentation is, you are not going to reach everybody in that room. And you are going to have students who come up to you and say, that is the best lecture I ever went to, and other students who are thinking, I was bored out of my mind through the whole thing. Students have a lot of things happening in their heads. They're worried about what else is happening in school. They're worried about the test that's coming up. They're worried about why they would ever need to know this information. They're worried about all kinds of things that are going to distract them from paying attention in your class. And so all we can do is really do our best as instructors. Make sure we're clear on what the main points are, what our learning objectives are for them. Provide a way to remind them how this fits in with previous things they've learned. Build in brain breaks so they have time to consolidate information. Use principles of good slide design and good oral presentation. And don't take it personally if they're not participating that day. It's probably something happening with them. As long as you're doing your best, that's all anybody can ask you to do. If you have any questions, please contact the CVM Education Support Group at cvmces@umn.edu.